This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Zero Hour, or as I once considered naming the program, Love in the Ruins. No, look, Love in the Ruins was the name of a novel that was mildly popular in Great Britain when I was about 12 or 13 back in the 60s. And, I was big on science fiction then. And the premise of that novel was that there had been a thermonuclear war, of course, like the premise of every novel back then, and that only teenagers were left alive. But that wasn't why I thought of calling this show Love in the Ruins. I thought of calling this show Love in the Ruins because the middle class is close to ruin by now. A lot of the America we knew once is in ruins right now. My old hometown, Utica, New York, like a lot of towns, Michigan, Ohio, and elsewhere, is many parts of it are in ruin. Large segments of it are in ruins. The factories, half the homes, and so on. And look, everybody loves love. Love is a force for rebuilding. And I thought it would be an eye-catching title. And well, okay, I never thought of calling this show Love in the Ruins. But actually, I might be confusing that novel with another one that was around the same time, which the Rolling Stones at one point optioned to make a movie of it. Of course, they never did make the movie, unlike the Beatles or the Dave Clark Five or Elvis or all the other rock and roll stars of the time. But they were going to make a movie of this other novel that I think was called Only Lovers Left Alive. That was it. And the idea was that everybody over the age of 17 had died. And the idea was, I think, that back in those days, teenagers figured out that the only way they could have any fun, much less illicit fun, would be if all the adults were dead. So that was kind of a utopian novel for teenagers, Only Lovers Left Alive. And I certainly wouldn't call this show that. So I don't know why I'm bringing any of this up, except it comes to mind that Jim Jarmusch's new movie is also called Only Lovers Left Alive, and none of the reviews I've seen mention that there was a novel by the name. I haven't seen the movie. I'm a fan of his work, but apparently from what I've seen, the trailers and the reviews and all that, Jim Jarmusch's movie is about some impossibly chic and artistically inclined people with enormous aspirations to express themselves, unnaturally beautiful, pale, thin vampires who live by night, shun the light of day, and are self-obsessed with themselves and the art that they think they'll one day make. And, I'm sure I'll see it at one point. But to me, having lived through the 70s in the Lower East Side, I feel like I've been there, done that, all that whole culture of the time. I don't know why people still push this culture of pale, wasted, dissipated, junky chic, that kind of pale, sickly, vampiric culture of hipness lives on and on and on, kind of like vampires themselves. It can't be killed. And speaking of vampires and zombies and other things that can't be killed, there are ideas that can't be killed, especially economic ideas. I bet you didn't think I was ever going to get to the point of this entire monologue or what the show is about, did you? But there are economic ideas that have brought us to ruin and that can't be killed. Ideas about, quote unquote, a free market, ideas about the restorative power of capitalism, ideas about job creators. They live on and on and on as if they were, what's her name, Tilda Swinton, and they in an independent movie. They just can't die. And killing these undead ideas is the topic of our first interview, which will be an extended discussion with economist Dean Baker about the work of Thomas Piketty and his new book, Capital, in particular. That book is changing the conversation about economics, along with the work of great economists like Dean Baker, who have been fighting the good fight all along against these zombie vampire ideas about economics that are even harder to kill than the decadent killer movie vampire character meme. But these guys are fighting the good fight. I'm delighted to have Dean back with us. I'm delighted to be talking about Thomas Piketty's books. And Piketty himself in his book had some interesting things to say about why economics thrives on undead ideas. Maybe we'll get to that with Dean Baker. But in the meantime, I welcome you to a show that is not called Love in the Ruins or Only Lovers Left Alive. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. We'll be right back. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and our guest for the next section of the show is Dean Baker, who is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., and whose blog, Beat the Press, tries manfully or faithfully or courageously to correct the many, many economic misperceptions communicated by the American media. He has written about this phenomenon of Thomas Piketty and Piketty's ideas and what they mean for the progressive movement. Dean, thanks so much for coming back and joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
So listen, you wrote a couple of great pieces actually on I've been pronouncing it Piketty. That's right. Or is it Piketty? I hear both.
I think it's Piketty, but I won't swear to that.
Yes, well, I think he knows. He may be the only one on this continent who does for sure. But anyway, so Piketty, you wrote about his book Capital, and in essence, how should progressives respond? And I'm tempted to summarize it, but I'll probably just mangle it. So, I mean, maybe just in a few words to start off. What's your reaction to the book and to the reaction to the book?
Well, my reaction to the book is I thought it was a fascinating book. You know, there's a lot of great data. People may not be familiar with Piketty's prior history. He made a reputation, along with one of his main co-authors, Emmanuel Saez, for mining the tax data in the United States. If this seems obvious to people, like why didn't people use the tax data, it's hard to do. You can't. It's available to the public, but it takes a long time. You know, we can't just go down to the IRS and say, give us the tax files. You have to go through a long clearance process. Takes quite some time, but then you have a massive amount of data. The reason why this is important is that this is actual data on particular individuals. So we know how much, and I don't know whether he has Bill Gates, he could figure out who he is from, the names are blocked out. But the point is we could figure out exactly how much money different people are getting. Most of our other data sets are surveys, and they're generally top-coded. So that means we have Bill Gates there who might get, I don't know his income, we'll say $1 billion a year. And then we have someone else who's a successful lawyer gets $400,000 or $500,000. All we see is top code, and meaning that puts down. It says top code, or it won't say top code, but it'll say give some code 6666, and we can't tell that Bill Gates had $1 billion a year in income and the lawyer had 400,000. We just know that both of them are over the top code, which is something like 400,000. Depends on the survey.
And just to jump in for a second, I think there's an important policy aspect to that too, as well as an analytical aspect, which is, if my understanding is correct, and you'll let me know, the reason why they are classified as quote-unquote top code is because the person earning 400,000 and the person earning $1 billion are both in the top tax bracket, so they're taxed at the same rate. Is that correct?
Well, no, they're not top code for the tax purposes. We have a variety of surveys. When you get the unemployment numbers every month, that's a survey. There's another survey that the Federal Reserve Board conducts on wealth. There's a whole set of surveys that various agencies conduct, and those are the ones I'm referring to as being top coded. On the taxes, they're not top coded, but we don't have that. This is exactly what Piketty did. He arranged with the IRS that he would have access to the actual files. Again, he's not getting Bill Gates' tax return, but he's getting the information from Bill Gates' tax return. And
so he's getting the figures.
That's right. Yeah. So that means.
Yes. Okay.
So the point here is he could figure out what's actually happening in that top 1% or so. If I'm using the survey data that's publicly available, all I could see is, okay, we had 1 million people or whatever that were in this top code, and we don't know how much money they got. Now, what Piketty did with that was he was able to see, look at this. When we talk about the top 1%, they've really pulled away. So they had much more income there than we had realized, and particularly the top 10th of 1% or even the top 100th of 1%, there's been a really great divergence with those at the very, very top making out like bandits. So that was his contribution before this book. Now, when he did this book, he goes back and he compiles data on wealth for the United States, dating back in some cases to the pre-Revolutionary War period. He goes to 18th century France. So it's an exhaustive account that brings up to date, our understanding of wealth and income patterns, for the last 2 centuries in much of the world. So in that sense, it's a very, very useful book. Now, what's gotten the most controversy is he's saying, okay, going forward, what should we expect? And his argument is that, if we expect the future to be like the past, then we'll see a further concentration of income. So he tells this story that we saw an unusual period in the middle of the 20th century across the United States and much of Western Europe, where we saw income becoming less concentrated, but we should expect it to again become concentrated as we get through the rest of the century. It's called the volume called Capital for the 21st Century. So his expectation there is that we'll see greater concentration, and it's kind of a bleak picture in that respect. And he says, what can we do about that? And he suggests having some sort of wealth tax that will tax the wealth of these very high income, very wealthy people.
Now, we're talking with economist Dean Baker, and I just want to make sure that the audience understands, which is why I may at times play even slightly dumber than I am, and that is... And that is obviously, here's a guy who so many of us got so much out of his work on income inequality, where really the dramatic story I think people didn't understand was the inequality within the highest 1% themselves, how the 0.1% and the 0.01% are also pulling away at dramatic rates. But his book wasn't called Income in the 21st Century. It was called Capital in the 21st Century, meaning that, as you alluded to, he changed his focus, he changed his area, broadened his view at least to include the accumulation of wealth, not just differences in income, right?
Exactly, and it really it talks to a large extent about wealth, and there are stories that wealth is more concentrated than income. I mean, you take the bottom, I'd have to check the exact number here, but 30 or 40% of the population has zero wealth. Almost no one really has zero income. Pretty hard to imagine where you're living in if you have zero income. So poor people, but even they have positive income. But we have a large segment of the population literally has zero wealth. They, in many cases, negative. They owe more than whatever assets they might have. And then you have the top end, the top 0.1%, top 1% that have on the order, taking the 1%, some on the order of 30 or 40% of all wealth in the country. So you have a greater concentration of wealth than you do of income, and that is really the focus. And he argues we should expect it to become further concentrated in the decades ahead.
Great. Well, what I want to do is break open a little bit that maldistribution of wealth just for a couple minutes. We need to take a quick break now, but when we come back, and thank you so much for sticking with us, I want to talk a little bit more about that maldistribution of wealth and not just income. We'll be right back with economist Dean Baker. I'm Richard Eskow. Oh, I just got instructions not to break away. Great. So let's just keep going, and they'll edit that out for posterity. Okay, so we're talking about the maldistribution here of wealth as well as income, and there's an equation that he uses that's become quite notorious at this point. R is greater than G, meaning that if the return on, as I understand it, if the return on capital becomes greater than overall economic growth, this massive overaccumulation among the few becomes inevitable. Is that a reasonable way to paraphrase his findings?
That's right. It's a fairly simple story. So people who have wealth, they're seeing that grow more rapidly than the economy grows. So then, their wealth is rising relative to income, relative to other people's wealth.
So basically what he's saying is that we've reached a point where forces have a kind of momentum is underway that if we don't, I've likened it, at least in my head, to a black hole, where you reach that point of no return, and then the singularity starts forming. There's no stopping it unless something more powerful intervenes. I think what he's basically saying is that a very few have amassed an enormous amount of wealth. That wealth is able to grow faster than the economy as a whole. So unless something is done, ever increasing, because whatever you want to call it, oligarchic wealth and power becomes inevitable and will get progressively worse.
That's right. And, I think I would argue he's overly pessimistic on that score because, to my view, I've seen, just to put it as simply as possible, he looks at the equality we saw in the middle of the century, not just in the United States, but across much of West Europe, much of the world. he looks at that as sort of an anomaly. I don't see it as an anomaly. I see that as, we learned a lot about economic policy that we didn't know previously, Keynesian economics, to put it bluntly. And also we had the growth of the labor movement in the United States and elsewhere. So we had both political force and a changed understanding of the economy. So, my view is telling me that in, the 18th century, the 19th century, the rich were getting richer. It's kind of like, I sort of like this analogy. It's sort of like saying, well, we shouldn't expect our kids to live past 5 because, we can go back into the, the Middle Ages and the 18th century, and most kids didn't live past the age of 5. Why would you think kids could live past the age of 5? And I go, well, we have modern medicine now. We understand, the things that would cause, infants to die. And, I think that's a good argument. And I would say it's the same sort of story, when he presents evidence from, he goes back, in some cases, 2,000 years to antiquity. And I go, okay, it's fascinating evidence and worthwhile for many, many purposes. But I think there really is a changed understanding of the economy that allows us to grasp the levers in a way that we didn't previously, so that we don't have to see the same sort of concentration of income and wealth that we apparently saw during that period, at least according to his data.
Now, this is a fascinating topic. We're talking with economist Dean Baker about the new book Capital by Thomas Piketty. This is a fascinating topic because you have someone, and I'm certainly not picking on him. Paul Krugman has been extraordinarily generous and gracious in his praise towards the book Capital and towards Piketty's work. Everyone has benefited greatly from his research, but you have a certain number of Keynesians who used to say, as Krugman has said many times, this isn't rocket science. We know what to do. But they're also embracing a book that in effect says, well, yeah, but what you know to do doesn't work anymore. So without really, that I've seen, addressing the idea that, is he or is he not refuting the techniques that we have seen work in the past, and can we embrace the book and yet reject that aspect of it?
Yeah, I actually had an exchange with him. I was on a panel at the Urban Institute when he was in town last week, and I had an exchange with him, and he said, he didn't have evidence. He has beliefs about this, and I can't say I have airtight evidence, but, in several of my comments on the book, I pointed out all the ways in which we have government policies that prop up the incomes of the wealthy, and these are policies that can be changed. So, one of my favorites, if we talk about the financial sector, we have too big to fail banks, and the International Monetary Fund just came out with estimates of the implicit subsidies to the too big to fail banks, the guarantees from the government, I should say, to the too big to fail banks. They estimate it was $50 billion a year in the United States and $300 billion a year in the Eurozone countries. Those are huge. Those are very large relative to corporate profits. That's just one policy.
So we're getting into the aspect of the discussion that has to do with policy solutions Piketty may have not emphasized properly, and we'll get more into that when we come back from this break with economist Dean Baker. We're talking about Thomas Piketty's new book and the discussion of inequality in the United States. We'll be right back with Dean Baker after this break. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you are listening to, and this is, The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour with economist Dean Baker. We are talking about the book that is number one in Amazon sales, followed closely, by the way, by Elizabeth Warren's new book, A Fighting Chance. So the Amazon demographic is moving in our direction. Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital in the 21st Century. And by the way, Dean, nobody got this, but Capital, the title Capital, is obviously an allusion to Marx, and in one of my responses to him, I entitled it "What Is to Be Done," which was an allusion to Lenin, who tried to put Marx's works into practice with a book called "What Is to Be Done." That was my
I got the reference to Marx. The title of my first review was "Mired Too Much in the 19th."
Right. Okay, exactly. And where we are with this book is, in my opinion, is, look, Piketty is brilliant. He's charming. He is fascinating to read, and he's offered a number of insights in this book, and his previous research. I'm a little concerned, and this is why, I've been following your work on this subject, that the entire movement, the response to his book could lead us down an alley where people start thinking, well, the only thing that could really make a difference is a kind of global wealth tax. And since that's never going to happen, I guess we're just falling into the black hole and there's nothing that can be done about it. And, one of the things that struck me in reading the book is that I think he may be just a little infatuated with that idea at the expense of others. For example, he writes, this is me quoting his book, according to our estimates, the optimal top tax rate in the developed countries is probably above 80%. Now, this is according to his research, which we've seen before, but he says that, and yet at the same time, he really is pushing, or the top line idea in his book is a global tax on capital, which he admits is a utopian idea. Now, I would argue that higher marginal tax rates for billionaires are far more doable than a global wealth tax, and that there are other ideas in what you call our bag of tools. So I wanted to pivot from this sort of dazzling display of intellect and erudition to what is to be done. And there you wrote a piece where you said we do have a set of tools at our disposal, and maybe we could talk about that for a minute. First of all, do you agree that maybe Piketty got a little bit distracted by the new idea and gave a little bit of short shrift to some of the tried and true older ones?
Well, I frankly, I don't know if it was a new idea, but in any case, I think he wants to. I think there's sort of a fundamental story here, and this is the nature of my review. And you're very much right. His book is titled "Capital in the 21st Century." He's thinking of picking up where Marx left off, and that's I think important. People have used this as a slur. I don't consider it a slur. Marx was a great thinker. Whatever you like, what you want to take or not take from him, he was a serious thinker, and Piketty obviously treats him that way. Point was, Marx saw capitalism as this system that had kind of its inherent logic that really could not be altered in fundamental ways, and I think Piketty sees it the same way. So he goes, capital, we're going to have greater concentration of wealth and income. And my view was that, no, capital could be structured a billion different ways. It's infinitely malleable. And I titled one of my other pieces, "Living in the Short Run," reference to Keynes. We could do 1,000 things to change the profitability of capital. That's not given to us by the gods. And, that's why I was starting to talk about too-big-to-fail banks in the financial sector. We changed rules to let the financial sector grow and become enormously profitable over the last 4 decades. You can't tell me that's inherently capital. We'd still have capitalism if we hadn't done that.
Right. And let me just jump in for a second and say we're talking with economist Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. I love that phrase, infinitely malleable, and I don't want to move beyond this aspect of his work for a second, if we might, because in retrospect, yes, Marx was a great thinker, but the most effective criticisms of his work were that he had a mechanistic view. He saw things as operating mechanically, and so his ideas, as things became more fluid, or proved to be more fluid, may have been less applicable than he thought. There were different. It wasn't just a dialectic between immovable and eternal forces. And so I love that phrase, infinitely malleable. So are you saying in effect that Piketty falls into a little bit of a mechanistic kind of trap in his view of things, that somehow he thinks this structure of capital is eternal and unchanging?
I would say he tends to fall into that, which, again, I don't mean to say the guy's stupid or anything. It's just, I think that is, and I think he tries to set it up that way. What are sort of the fundamentals of the system? And again, I had some of an exchange with him, so it's not as though, he's not aware of this, but he thinks, okay, here we have a fundamental dynamic, and I'm saying, no, it's actually not very fundamental. We could change this in many ways so that it doesn't have to lead to ever greater concentration. And, I conclude one of my pieces by going, look, we could do A, B, C, D, E. I list a number of items, which is hardly exhaustive. It can go on longer in my list, and I'm sure others would add more. And all of those things would reduce profitability, reduce the concentration of wealth. Now, could we do all those things and then still, again, see wealth concentrating? certainly possible. And my quip there was, well, but then we'd be talking about capital in the 22nd century. We have a big agenda here.
So what are some of those things? You began to talk about the implicit government subsidy for too big to fail banks, and a new study, which I think made a case that subsidy was implicit subsidy, or was even greater than had been thought. Is that correct?
Well, certainly in the case of the Eurozone, I mean, $300 billion is that was the IMF's figure. That's about 20%, probably more than 20% of after-tax corporate profits in the Eurozone. So what that's saying is, if we took away the subsidy, this is just one policy, admittedly a big policy, but the implicit subsidy that the government's giving the big banks in the Eurozone, we'd be reducing profits there on the order of 20%. It's a little more complex than that, but that's sort of a first blush there. Another part of the story, just sticking with finance for a second, finance is grossly undertaxed. The IMF says that. If we go buy a shirt, shoes, food in most states, we're going to pay tax. But you trade shares of stocks, derivatives, no tax. So why not tax finance? And again, here, even the IMF's saying that. So again, that's a big hit to their profits. Moving to other sectors, we spend about 2% of GDP, about $380 billion a year on pharmaceuticals. We do that because the government gives them patent monopolies. That's to give them incentive to do research. Well, I think it's a really horrible way to give them incentives, because it gives them incentives to lie. It gives them incentive to say their drugs are effective when they're not, or say they're safe when they're not. So if we had a different mechanism, we would spend a lot less for drugs, and you'd see much lower profits in the pharmaceutical industry. There's a lot of areas where we privatize things, allow big profits in cases where the government could do things more efficiently. I mean, we've talked about this with healthcare. I think I've been on your show talking about that. Certainly a universal Medicare system would be far more efficient than the system of private insurers. The insurers take 15 to 20% of what gets paid out in healthcare expenditures. They use that for administrative costs. Medicare, by comparison, it's 2 to 3%. So there's a long list of places we can go where we're allowing companies to make profits in ways that in some cases depend directly on a government subsidy, or in other cases mean having a less efficient economy. I mean, why shouldn't we have the most efficient possible economy? So I think we have a long list of these things that, again, many of us have been working on for years. We should keep working on them, and, the impact, insofar as you succeed in pushing these changes, it's to lower profits. So, again, global wealth tax, that would be a great thing, and, when we get that, that'll be wonderful. But in the meantime, we have a lot of things we can and should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get a resolution out of the UN Security Council. So, a global wealth tax right now, to me, seems like quite a stretch. And all the things you mention are strong and powerful. And I guess we're at a moment now where it seems that this book has really caught the imagination of a broad range of people. And Piketty seems to have that gift. He certainly, the 99%, 1% rhetoric, a lot of people have said, and it makes sense that in many ways was based upon the research that he pioneered in income distribution and so on. We are the 99%. And so he does have a way of doing that. And that was a very powerful and effective phrase and way of thinking about the world and the economic world. But somehow we demand a global wealth tax. Seems like it won't go anywhere. So is there, here we are at this moment where this book has captured public imagination, and I tend to think of these things a little bit tactically, which is one way to look at it would be this has galvanized the discussion in our direction. Another way would be this has galvanized the discussion but turned it to the theoretical and fuzzy and won't add energy to the movement. The third is more of the tactical activist approach. It says, how do we take this moment and get people talking about the right things and pushing for the right things? If you get where I'm going with this, is how can we leverage this book to talk about some of the solutions that you're recommending?
Well, I was joking, when I was on the panel, we were talking, and he's going, look, parts 1, 2, and 3 of my book, this is data, there shouldn't be much to argue over, and that's separable from part 4, where he talks about his global wealth tax and other policy. So I was joking, look, I'm a part 1, 2, and 3 Pikettian. It's great in terms of, he's documented this massive upward redistribution of wealth and income. That has to be our backdrop. His policy prescriptions, I'd say, global wealth tax, wonderful, but, we all know these things that have redistributed income upwards, and we have to fight on them. And, two things that are in the public debate right now, it's just kind of striking, because I'm sure we're going to get all these people reading and praising Piketty's book, and then they're going to take the wrong stand on them. One, the trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact. These are corporate agreements. These are, whatever, I was just on panel this morning talking to someone, every time I talk and think about it, it's worse than I realize, because this is, we have the richest people in the country sit down and say, how do we want to structure a trade pact? And then they say this is free trade. Nothing to do with free trade. This is your corporate wish list. Anyone who read Piketty's book and understands it should want to take a baseball bat to those agreements. There's no question. They're not close. It's just like, no, you want to have a trade agreement? Let's bring in Rich Trumka. Let's have consumer groups in there. We could talk about how to structure a trade agreement that will make the country better off. You don't get the heads of Pfizer and Merck and Time Warner and all the other people that they had there. This is a joke. So, but you'll have people read Piketty and they go, oh yeah, but we got to support this trade agreement. The other thing along the same lines that seems to be heating up, the privatization of Fannie and Freddie. Why on earth are we trying to privatize Fannie and Freddie? They're doing their jobs. Show me the problem. I've been saying to people, show me the problem. And people say, well, we don't want public. Okay, so if you're just telling me you don't like public companies, that's one thing. That's not saying that there's a problem. It's just, I don't like chocolate ice cream. Okay, that's fine. But, that's not really a good argument for public policy. And the worst part of it is that if we were to privatize them, if we really decide, we just really hate public companies, then privatize them. Don't have a government guarantee. But what they're proposing is absolutely the worst possible thing. They're proposing that we're going to have all the investment banks issuing mortgage-backed securities again, just like they did back in the housing bubble days. But this time, they'll issue them with a 90% government guarantee.
Thank you, Dean. I just have to interrupt. We're talking with Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Sometimes talking to you is like talking to a therapist, because it makes me feel the way I did when I worked, in the Wall Street area in the '90s, and these things would come through, and I was mostly risk management, but these things would come through, and everybody would be talking about how wonderful this structured deal was, and I would be thinking, am I crazy? This looks like it's full of holes to me, and the answer was no. And this is the way I've been feeling about the Fannie and Freddie discussion is, why are we even talking about this? So, and going back to Piketty, first three chapters versus the fourth, it's interesting because the fourth being, of course, what to do in a sense. It's interesting. What makes Piketty so engaging in the first three sections to me is what he loses in the fourth, which is he makes an eloquent case for not walling the science of economics off from the social sciences, or for that matter, the liberal arts. And he talks about how much money a Balzac hero would need to have lived on during the Belle Epoque or whatever. It's fascinating. It's fun. He talks about how human beings behave in economic systems. Then in the fourth, it seems he gets lost a little bit in abstractions and doesn't think so much about, for example, well, in the solutions world, if you imposed a financial transactions tax and other ways tax the financial industry, human beings might choose to go into it less. And, that sort of integrated approach seems to melt away a little bit. And I don't know where I was going with that exactly, except to say that I think he gets a little seduced by the abstract. And so what should we do now going forward to shape the direction, to shape the discussion in the direction we want it to go?
Well, I think that we have to think about policies that, reverse the upward redistribution of income. And, Piketty, again, we had a cordial discussion. He's a very nice person, not that I know him extensively, but we had a chance to talk a bit. And, his challenge to me is kind of, well, show me how much money's there. So, let's do the work. I mean, me as an economist, my responsibility to try and document, how much money's there. I've done some of that, and I hope to have a chance to do more. And, in terms of, the politics, people who care about having a decent society, where we know we could reduce this upward redistribution, take the steps that we can to do that. Again, listing some of them. Unions, we should, of course, mention. That was one of the things that, I mentioned in discussions with him that, I expect we've had, both a big hit to workers in a sense of deunionization, but also, the competition with the developing world, most importantly China. And, to my mind, there's a plus there that, You've had very rapid wage growth in China over the last 10 or 15 years, which means there's still huge difference in wages. I mean, say Chinese workers are getting as much as we do, but the gap has narrowed enormously, and China as a haven of really cheap labor is rapidly disappearing. And the good part of that story, there are no more Chinas there. There's no other country with 1.3 billion people where you can get workers for less than $1 an hour. That doesn't exist anymore. So I think there's a lot of positives there.
Well, before let me just take one quick side break, because I think I found the outright flaw, not just interpretation but fact. And I'm not going to try to look it up now, but somewhere in the book, actually, page 489, according to my notes, Piketty says that we can't solve pension problems using techniques that were built when average lifespan was 60 or 70. Now that average lifespan is 80, is going on 80 and above. And I looked at that and I thought, et tu, Piketty, do you also, isn't he wrong? I mean, isn't that stuff you and I have fought in our different ways for years, this misconception? Aren't those changes primarily about infant mortality, and isn't he misstating the case?
Yeah, he is misstating the case, and there have been increases. So even if we restrict it to age 65, there have been increases, but of course much smaller. I mean, so if we're talking about increases of life expectancy at birth, it is something like 15 or 20 years. I'd have to check the exact numbers, but it's very dramatic. But if you go, okay, but what's the increase at age 65, the period where you're actually getting your pension? It's on the order, depending how far back we go, 3 or 4 years, which isn't inconsequential, but that's certainly the sort of increase that we can manage, and you manage it by doing things we've already done. We used to pay, you go back to 1960, we were paying about 4 percentage points, that's combined employer-employee, and Social Security taxes. Today we're paying 12.4 percentage points. Most people, we still have higher wages even after paying those taxes because we've had productivity growth. So, we could do things, in terms of Social Security, raising the cap, and, as we go on through time, assuming we actually get wage growth again, I'm not terrified by the idea that you might see some further increase in the payroll tax, again, assuming wages grow. So the idea that there's some fundamental problem there that can't be solved, I think that's badly mistaken.
So in the couple minutes we have left, Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, how would you sum up how we should talk about the Piketty capital wealth maldistribution conversation going forward?
Well, I'll say we should all be parts 1, 2, and 3 Piketty, and it's a fantastic book in terms of documenting the patterns of income and wealth distribution over several centuries, and really points to the problem we face with growing inequality. So we should appreciate that he's done so much to document that, call attention to that. And then we have to come up with our own solutions, which include, as I say, many of the things that many of us have already been working on. We always have to look for new things. It's not that we have a complete set and we should be satisfied, but we all have been working on policies to address this inequality. And the idea that somehow some mysterious law of capitalism will prevent that, no. I mean, what will prevent it is that we have rich people with lots of power that will try to keep us from implementing these policies. But we know what the policies are, and we know what needs to be done.
So, in other words, the fight goes on, and we now have a fascinating book whose first 3 sections give us a lot more information to wage that struggle with. Fair?
Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it.
All right. Thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for spending so much time with us. Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
And we will be right back after this with a lot more fascinating guests talking about, I lost my notes, but all kinds of good stuff. Strike me. This is why you come to the Zero Hour, because we get deep into a subject, we get so engrossed in it, we don't think about the formalities of radio broadcasting. And isn't that why you love this show? I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and believe me, we have a lot more coming up for you in the next 2 hours, so please stick with us. We'll be right back. This is the Zero Hour.
This is the Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WEACT Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hey, Hey, everybody. I'm Richard Eskow, RJ Eskow, and we are back on the Zero Hour. We've got a great program for you in this hour. But before we get to that, I want to talk to you about a myth. I want to talk to you about the Amazon myth in particular, and I want to talk to you about how myths, like the myth of Amazon as a creation of a single genius entrepreneur, alter people's understanding of how the world works and lead people to misunderstand how the world works and leads people not to understand how much government policy matters. And now I want to look up, I wrote a piece about this on Salon this week. A new study confirms what a lot of people have suspected for a long time about Amazon, which is that it benefits a lot from a tax loophole. In fact, the study, which comes from the National Bureau for Economic Research, shows us that at least 10% of Amazon's current revenue comes from its tax loophole, the one where it hasn't had to collect state sales tax for the things it sells online. Now, here's the way it works. Because it hasn't had to apply sales tax in the past, it was able to grow very quickly. Here's what happened. When they did a study, because 5 states began requiring that Amazon collect the sales tax. In other words, 5 states took away Amazon's tax advantage, tax loophole advantage. Actually, now it's up to 19, but they studied 5. They studied California, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia. So they got a cross-section of types of states and types of people. And here's what they found. They found that Amazon's online sales fell by nearly 10% when the sales tax advantage was removed. And also, I didn't put this in the piece, but sales went up for their marketplace, quote unquote, where they've always had to charge tax and where they sell more expensive high-end items, but on behalf of other people, other independent retailers. So what does this mean? Does this mean that Amazon would have been 10% less successful if it hadn't had this sales tax advantage all along? Does it mean that Jeff Bezos, the CEO, who's worth a reported $22 billion, would only be worth a little less than $20 billion, $19.8 billion? No, I don't think so. And here's why. Because when Amazon began, a lot of people found it difficult to navigate. They found they had a hard time adapting to its structure and process. It's become much better. Not that it was bad, but remember, the internet was young 20 years ago, too. And even 10 years ago, it was something that a lot of people, particularly certain populations, were not that familiar with. So Amazon was a challenge for a lot of people. But that lack of a state sales tax was a huge advantage. So I would put to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Amazon wouldn't be 10% smaller without this advantage. It would be substantially smaller. And therefore, it might, I think it would have survived. Jeff Bezos is a brilliant and driven guy. I'm not suggesting that Amazon wouldn't have been successful, but it became so successful and so dramatically large that it's single-handedly given credit for crowding out the retail business, especially retail booksellers. And there are those of us, call us sentimental, and I know it's controversial. And in fact, maybe we'll have somebody on to debate this, but I think that we've lost a lot by losing so many physical bookstores, especially the small independent ones. So do you know now, by the way, parenthetically, that in the island of Manhattan, there are only 5 bookstores left because of the soaring rents. But anyway, going back to I think when a literary island with such a rich history of literature as Manhattan only has 5 bookstores left, it's tragic. But going back to Amazon. So here you have an entity that had an enormous advantage, leveraged the heck out of that for years. And not only did it become enormous, but it was credited as being a kind of libertarian success story. Look at Amazon. Look at how well a creative person can do without this government interference and all that. Well, the fact is, government policy created Amazon. When the decision was made not to require online retailers, of which Amazon was the dominant player, to collect sales tax, state sales tax, that gave them an enormous advantage. That created an entity. So what we talk about as a libertarian success story is really the product of government policy, including, I would suspect, some very aggressive lobbying. Now, in addition to that, that didn't just create Amazon. It also led to a situation where a lot of independent retailers have been driven out of business. So it changed the economic landscape. It changed the retail landscape. Why? Not because of the brilliance of one man, not because of the brilliance of an idea, not because of the forces of the free market either. This wasn't a free market success story. This was a success story based on a tax loophole to a large extent. Now, where do we go from here? Well, now Amazon got so big that it had to start building distribution centers and warehouses in different states. There's something called the permanent establishment rule that says if you have a permanent fixed place of business in a state, you have to collect state sales tax. That's the main reason why Amazon is now collecting the sales tax in 19 states. And in addition, a couple other states went after it pretty aggressively, so it cut a deal. So now it's collecting state sales tax in 19 states, but other online retailers are not necessarily doing this. So what happens to Amazon? This is from the Wall Street Journal article. Quote, even as Amazon fights sales tax in some states, it is supporting a bill that would apply an online sales tax nationwide. Again, quoting from the Wall Street Journal, Amazon thinks such a law would level the playing field with e-commerce rivals who don't have affiliates, meaning don't have to collect this tax. The bill is pending in Congress. So what happens? Amazon rides its loophole as long as it can, aggressively goes after retailers, drives a lot of them out of business. Then when other people start to catch up with it, or it's in the same boat as the retailers, now it has to collect the sales tax. Oh, now it wants a sales tax for everyone. Now it wants a level playing field. It didn't want one when the tilt was in its advantage, but it wants it now. Does that sound like a free market success story to you? Does that sound like a libertarian economy or libertarian company to you? I don't know about you, but I don't think so. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And if I'm not tragically mistaken, we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and with us is my good friend Ernie Powell. Ernie is a veteran organizer and political activist who began his career with Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Union, and most recently he was the grassroots national director at, I always struggle with this name and this acronym, National Committee to Protect Social Security and Medicare. Before that, he managed policy issues on behalf of AARP, and it's more than 3 million California members, and was the state senior advocacy manager. Before that, he was associate state director for California. So, Ernie, I guess you could say you've been fighting for the old since we were young. And thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's to preserve, but they also want to protect, but it's to preserve in the formal title for the National Committee.
I told you I have problems with this. Maybe it should be
I forget it once in a while myself, so that's okay. That's okay.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you know, I said it, you know, just somewhat flippantly that that, you know, you've been fighting on behalf of the old since we were young, but really, and one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is reframing that entire conversation, which is something you've been working on, to say it's really not about the old versus the young, is it?
Yeah. No, it's not. You know, when you think of these programs, these great programs that Social Security, which started in the depths of the Great Depression in 1935, and then LBJ passing Medicare and Medicaid in the 60s. A better way to think of them, and I think a more truthful way to think of them, is as family protection programs. Because what they do is they through the years their reach has expanded so that children can now receive Social Security benefits as surviving members of the family when the major wage earner has a disability accident or an accident that causes him or her to be disabled and or is tragically deceased. So disabled workers can collect Social Security and also can go on Medicare at any age that they have a workplace accident or somehow become disabled. So the framing of it is very important, and to think of these only as senior programs is to not understand the full depth of their value to all of us and their value to American families as we all struggle in these economic times.
Well, I think that's really well put. Now, I would add to that the fact that, God willing, if we're lucky, each of us, no matter what our age, will eventually become a senior person, and
Right.
we will certainly want these programs to be well and healthy. I'm particularly disillusioned by the cynical marketing of Social Security and Medicare cuts to millennials, as if they're not smart enough to understand that they're going to be 65 someday too.
Well, it's a tactic that has that the conservative movement or the right wing privatization movement has honed down, and what they do, and I learned a lot of this from the polling that was done when I worked at ARP in the mid '90s. We thought that because we knew we'd be facing the privatization sometime soon, and so ARP did some very extensive polling and focus groups, and what we learned was that everybody supported Social Security, but the key issue that the privatizers were going to use was the whole question of whether or not it's going to be there for me either in the near future or the long away future. And so no one has the gall or in some ways they don't campaign saying, I don't like these programs, I think these programs are bad ideas, which is what they really believe. What they do is they try to build out around the solvency of both Social Security and Medicare. So they make the argument that because the government is so inefficient, it's so wasteful, that these programs are going broke. And so the argument that we developed, and of course that's not true. I mean, Social Security is solvent all the way to 2033, and even then, it can pay 75% of its promised benefits with just a 1% growth rate in the economy. So you notch up the growth rate in the economy a little bit, and that extends the solvency.
Right, and nobody seems to talk about why the economy would need its growth rate notched up a little bit, which has more to do about Wall Street malfeasance than it does about anything else. And so we know that these programs are fundamentally robust. We want to organize to protect them. You're a veteran organizer. It's an intergenerational problem. These programs help. The assault on them is an intergenerational problem. These programs help families and young people, including, cynically enough, Representative Paul Ryan when he was a young man. So how do we organize so that all the generations can fight for programs that serve all of the generations?
Well, we organize based on the truth. That's one point, and the other point is that I'm through the years I've seen hundreds of ARP members and then with the national committee go on to college campuses and go into workplaces where people were to talk to employee groups or union groups, and once they hear that argument and once they hear the truth about the solvency issue and about the future of Social Security, I've seen some great coalitions built over the years that work side by side with seniors intergenerationally. So here's the point. I guess my best answer is that to say the truth to as many people as possible, and then also to tap that self-interest, because any day one can have a workplace accident and become disabled. Any day one could lose a major wage earner in the family. So we built over the years in the big fight we had in 2005 over privatization during the Bush administration, the fight against the chain CPI, all the way through that. We've talked to young people. We've worked with them as spokespersons. Because we were able to say, number one, tap their self-interest, and also I think tap the care that they feel sort of intergenerationally. No one wants seniors to be driven into poverty, and so I found younger people and people still in the workplace to be very, very receptive, and a group that we've been able to build into coalitions in for example, the 5 swing states when we did a lot of work in 2012 during the election cycle. So it's possible and it's doable, and that's the way you win on this issue.
Well, it's encouraging to hear, and affirms my faith in humanity a little bit too, because we are compassionate people who care about one another and not just ourselves. Also, I found, as you have from time to time, I've met with elected officials, and you show them the charts and you give them the logic and you show them the data and all of that. But sometimes what really gets their attention is election issues, and I know you've been
Hmm.
thinking about that a lot and maybe considering some work in that area. Anything you want to say about that side of it?
Well, I'm with a small group of people across the country, and it's small because we're still in the development stage, to build a new organization called Senior Votes Count. And we just got started in the last few months, and we're developing policies and we're developing strategies. And our Senior Votes Count will be a senior organization dealing with these family protection issues that will deal at, or work, at the electoral level. We will endorse candidates and we will oppose candidates, and we will raise funds. We just got approved as a PAC and as a C4. The adjunct organization with the Senior Votes Count PAC is going to be called Senior Votes Count Institute, where we'll do good intergenerational research. We'll do good research on issues that people talk about during the election cycle, looking for the right messaging, the good organizing tactics. That'll be part of the Institute's job as an ancillary organization, working next or side by side to the PAC. And we'll have our website up. We think within the next 30 days, and I'm very, very excited about this potential. Most of the senior groups in the country do a great job, but they work in a nonpartisan way, and they work from a perspective of education and mobilizing voters. But again, they do it in a nonpartisan way. We're going to go the next step. We're going to say, we're going to endorse you if you're good on the issues, if you support Social Security, if you oppose privatization, if you support Medicare, if you don't buy into all the lies about the so-called $700 billion cuts, but understand that Medicare is going to be there, and it's going to be there in the future. So Senior Votes Count is something I'm really excited about, and we look for that announcement, RJ. We would hope within the next 30 days.
Well, we'll be looking for it, and we'll be bringing you back when it comes on. But in the meantime, also would point out that seniors who do vote in disproportionately large numbers, especially in off-year elections, as you know, have always cared about the generations that follow them. That's always showed up in the polling. So, listen, when we come back, I would love to talk to you more about your time with the farm workers and those days. I know a new movie came out about Cesar Chavez, and maybe get your thoughts on that and on what we
Okay.
can do to build a spirit of organization going forward. So if you can hang with us for another segment, we'd love to talk to you a little more.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Well, we sure appreciate that. I'm RJ Eskow. We're talking with Ernie Powell, veteran organizer. We'll be back talking about the early days of the farm workers. Thanks so much for listening. Stick around. It's going to be great. Again, I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard R.J. Eskow, and with us is veteran organizer Ernie Powell. We get so we get so discouraged sometimes talking about the powerlessness of the many and the power of the few, and the accumulation of capital and the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of political power, and the way our government works like an oligarchy, and all the studies that emphasize the disempowerment of ordinary human beings, that sometimes it's good to remember those moments in history when people who seemed to be utterly powerless fought back, made a difference, and changed things for themselves and everyone. And Ernie Powell was there for one such moment, one such inspiring glimpse of the power of a population mobilized, and that was, of course, the formation of the United Farm Workers and their ultimate successes in organizing in the state of California and elsewhere. And Ernie, I was wondering if we could ask you about that a little bit.
Well, it was the beginning of my organizing career, and it was an incredible experience for me. I can't tell you how much it it molded me, and it taught me, and it inspired me. I started doing just picketing in supermarkets in 1968 as part of the Great Boycott operation. And every day I would go to a Safeway or a Vons or Lucky's, usually with somebody else, and ask people not to go into the store because it had non-union grapes. And then I was going to school at the same time, and while I was in college in San Diego, this is later on, towards more like 1970, there was a strike in a tomato grove in southern San Diego County, and I got involved in that by doing support through local churches, and I just forgot about college and went on full time. I also was there because I was part of the boycott operation in Los Angeles. I was able, in quite a moment this was, to go to the signing of the grape contracts when Caesar came into the room with all the grape growers that we'd all been fighting for so many years, and I actually was there in the ceremony as part of the audience. And then later on was part of the lettuce boycott. I worked in Napa Valley organizing workers, and then from Napa Valley was assigned to Philadelphia on what was then called the Wine 9 boycott, a boycott against some wineries, and then the bigger operation, which was the lettuce boycott. And so I saw the sacrifice, I saw the commitment, I saw the kind of strategic approach that the farm workers movement had, and all of it on $5 a week. Nobody was paid a salary. It was, and so what I learned from it was how much this is about hard work and about commitment and about unity. And it was quite an opportunity for me, and I am honored to have had that history and really relish it and love talking about it, to tell you the truth.
And, I don't think people today who weren't around then, and I was pretty young in 1968, but I remember, and I don't think that people nowadays realize just how powerless the farm workers of 1967 seemed to be at the time, right? I mean, they were almost invisible to the society as a whole. Is that fair?
It's fair. Their living conditions in the labor camps were just terrible. Let me give you an example, and you can see this in the movie that just came out a few months ago about Caesar, the biography on Caesar, which I thought was very well done and very inspiring for me to see. And I would hope that your audience would go to see it themselves. But just an example, the way in which the local sheriff in Delano and the local courts and the entire sort of system there dominated the whole dynamic. I mean, they were able to get this one, and this is really hard to believe, but it's true. They actually got an injunction stopping farm workers during the strike and the picketing in Delano and throughout the Kern County and the valley there. They got an injunction to stop farm workers from saying the word huelga. Huelga means strike.
And huelga, for our audience, means
strike.
Right.
Viva la huelga means long live the strike. And so that here's the point. I'm using that as an illustration of the level of power that the growers had in those years, and to have organized these workers, all of whom were poor workers, had very bad living conditions, no health care, no benefits as employees, was quite an astounding moment. And it just grew and grew and grew, and many people that came off the picket line and they went to other cities on the boycott, and the combination of the sort of discipline of the strike and the ability to get as many workers, because they just kept importing more what's called in labor parlance scabs or non-union workers, and they were able, because of the strength of the movement and the strength of their argument and the consistency of the picketing, it was very hard to get those grapes picked, because people they'd be brought in to break the strike, and they'd see the value of the cause, and they would just join right there and get on the picket line. And then the power of the boycott, the consumer boycott, was nationalized and then internationalized this movement. It is an organizing model and an organizing example that I think is just incredible to have been part of, and incredible to study, and an incredible model to use in other movements.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go. I never had the opportunity to meet Cesar Chavez. I did meet and introduce at an event Dolores Huerta, who was also, of course, major organizer of the farm workers and incredible personality. And surely the power of these individuals is part of it, but not all of it. And what do you think in the couple minutes we have left? What can we do to reconnect with the kind of channel the kind of energy we saw taking place during that period in the farm workers' history?
Well, the fundamental assumption of that movement, and the fundamental assumption of any grassroots movement, is to organize people that are impacted by the issue. And so what the farm workers movement did really well was talk to people directly impacted, that's family members of farm workers themselves, of course, and to through the unity of the argument and through the unity of the organization, inspire them, and then give them the tools, teach the strategy, teach the tactics, and so that together you have the strength of leaning on each other and depending on each other. And I saw that very clearly in the farm workers movement. I guess my point is that one does not win these battles alone. One must organize people who are directly impacted and people who care about the issue. And the model that I saw in the farm workers, and that we all can take from that model, is an organizing model that says that you have that in order to win these fights, it's critical to engage the very people that are involved in it. It's not a top-down thing. It is, in a way, it's a democratization of struggle. And in the Farm Workers Union and the movement itself, as it was then and as it continues, is one of the best models ever for that kind of a theory of organizing and theory of fighting for justice.
Well, and one of the things that does, we're talking with Ernie Powell, veteran organizer, about the early days of the farm worker movement and the latter days as well. But one of the things, that kind of organization, that lateral strength that comes from people working together and relying on one another, is an enormous tenacity. And, I was always struck by the unwillingness to give up. And, even in my own small way, look, as I said, I was 14, I was preoccupied, I was political, but I was preoccupied with learning, the chords to Purple Haze or something, and yet, the first time I went to the supermarket and there was somebody there saying, "Don't buy grapes." It was, what? Don't buy grapes? The second time it was, really, you're still here? Well, yeah, okay, I'll take your piece of paper. The third time it was like, oh, okay, I get it. Don't buy grapes. The fourth time I was telling other people, don't buy grapes. But that required people who were so committed to one another as well as the process and the movement that they would stay there time and time after again and replicate that with hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And isn't that part of the secret of the success there?
Absolutely. It's a commitment of the organization. It's the commitment of the organizers, and it's the commitment of those people that are impacted the most to communicate that message, to get support from the public. And that's an organizing model that works, and that we learn from the great success and the great accomplishments of the farm workers movement.
Well, and speaking of great accomplishments, Ernie Powell, thanks so much for being with us. We're going to come back after this break with Richard Rothstein, an economist with the Economic Policy Institute, about updating ourselves on the status of Brown versus Board of Education 60 years later, speaking of long-term organizing. Ernie, thanks so much for being with us, and I hope you'll come back and talk more about these great subjects with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, RJ. Bye-bye.
You bet. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. You can call me RJ. You can call me anything you want. And we will be right back after this. Again, this is WEAC Radio Network, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us is Richard Rothstein, who is a research associate with the Economic Policy Institute. And Richard has written a very important paper on Brown versus the Board of Education 60 years later, that, of course, being the landmark Supreme Court ruling requiring the integration of schools and striking down the concept of separate but equal in education. And Richard has written a provocative piece about that, suggesting that it succeeded in ways that may not have been expected and failed in ways that may have been expected. Richard Rothstein, thanks so much for being with us.
Good morning.
Now, my one-sentence summary of your piece, I don't know if it did it justice or not, but let me know. Did it?
Well, it was close. I don't know. I don't think that it was expected that Brown would fail to integrate schools, but in fact, the day after the Brown decision was issued, Thurgood Marshall, who was then the lead attorney for the plaintiffs, said he expected that within 5 years, schools across the country would be desegregated.
Well, I'm going to plead for an upgrade in the grade you just gave me, because what I actually said was that it failed in ways that might have been expected to succeed and succeeded in ways that weren't expected.
Oh, okay.
Which sounds about right, I guess, as you say that.
Yes, I said what I said in the piece is that it stimulated a whole civil rights movement that succeeded in other areas. Public accommodations, sit-ins took place, freedom rides. A number of civil rights bills were passed. The area where it succeeded the least was in desegregating schools, which are today nationwide as segregated as they've ever been.
Well, and in fact, I believe you said at one point that things were getting worse.
Well, they are getting worse since 1980. The courts enforced desegregation up until about 1980, at which point the composition of the courts changed, the Supreme Court in particular, and school districts began to be released from desegregation orders, and since then, segregation nationwide has increased. And it's increased because our residential segregation has increased. Black students are now more isolated from white students than they have been any time in the last 35 years.
So we had a decision that had the very laudable effect of bringing the issue of segregation to the public consciousness and changing public attitudes and perhaps contributing substantially to the rise of the civil rights movement and many of the changes that arose out of that. We had some improvements, but they reversed in 1980. Things, if anything, are getting worse because of residential patterns and so on. What about 1980 do you think caused a shift in the trend?
Well, the main reason, as I said, is the courts began to back off requiring school districts to desegregate. But as you just mentioned, the real issue is that schools are segregated today because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And we have done very little to adopt the kinds of housing policies that would be necessary to desegregate our neighborhoods. So African Americans in most urban areas, metropolitan areas in this country, are living in neighborhoods that are concentrated, largely poor in many cases, and this is all a legacy of 20th century federal, state, and local policy that purposely segregated these neighborhoods. And because they were segregated by public policy, we're unlikely to desegregate them without public policies that undo the effects of the last century.
We're talking with Richard Rothstein of the Economic Policy Institute. Well, tell us about that government policy that led to that segregation.
For example, I think
people need to know that.
Have probably heard of large suburban developments like Levittown, or in California, Daly City, or Lakewood, south of Los Angeles. All over the country, these large suburban developments were financed with guarantees from the federal government on condition that the federal government said that no homes be sold to African Americans. So the whole suburbanization that took place in the mid-20th century was segregated by federal requirement and subsidized by the federal government. We have not undone those policies. The suburbs that were created in that time have now appreciated in value. At the time, in the mid-20th century, African Americans, along with whites, could have afforded to move to those suburbs. they've now appreciated. Working class people, middle class people can frequently no longer afford to move to those suburbs. And so the patterns that were set by public policy in the mid-20th century have endured. And as a result, we have segregated neighborhoods that persist in this country, despite the nominal prohibition of discrimination in housing.
And so what you have also is a vicious circle where even though we have allegedly, and as you say, a nominal prohibition in housing discrimination, it's very hard for people to afford them without jobs, good jobs, and the jobs tend to be where these houses are, making it even harder for people to break in. So you have this ongoing segregation that's a historical legacy of government policy. Well, tell us briefly then, what kind of policy do you think might serve to undo this damage that was done in the past?
Well, there are a number of policies we could pursue, and they won't solve the problem entirely, but there are some small steps we can take. Many suburbs have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of low and moderate income housing. They're called exclusionary zoning ordinances. Those could be prohibited to enable developers to construct low and moderate income housing in white suburbs, predominantly white suburbs. We have a program which subsidizes the rents of low-income families so that they can afford to rent apartments at market rents, but we don't have a requirement that landlords have to accept those subsidies, those vouchers that these families have. We could require landlords to not discriminate against the housing choice voucher holders, and that would permit more African Americans to move to more middle-class neighborhoods.
And there was also a time in history when it was not unthinkable to discuss building subsidized housing in relatively well-to-do neighborhoods so that these living patterns of separation and segregation could be broken down. It seems like that's left the national conversation altogether.
Well, you're absolutely right. That was the next thing I was going to mention. That has to be combined with the repeal of these exclusionary zoning ordinances. But as you just noted, simply repealing an ordinance that prohibits the construction of that kind of housing won't do any good unless we subsidize the construction of that kind of housing. So both policies are necessary.
Well, in about the minute we have left, Richard Rothstein of the Economic Policy Institute, what can people do with this information? They can obviously go to epi.org and read your fine work on this, but are there organizations you're aware of, ways people can maybe get their voice heard on this subject?
Well, there are many organizations throughout the country. I can't name them in different cities for you. There wouldn't be time, but there are many organizations that promote low and moderate income housing in suburban neighborhoods, and people can Google those in their communities and find them to help support them.
I think this is such an important contribution to the conversation. So I thank you for writing this piece. And I think that people, too much of our public policies nowadays is around this issue is driven by despair or fear or uncertainty. And I think you've done a lot to dispel those kinds of dark clouds over this topic. So Richard Rothstein of the Economic Policy Institute, thanks for joining us and talking about this subject with us.
Thank you very much.
Now, we will be back in the next hour talking about the problems of prediction with futurist Jaime Cassio. I was called a futurist in a book by Rough Guide, but I don't. We'll talk about what that word even means. I'm not even sure. We'll be talking about the student activism that's taking place against Peabody Energy with a student activist. We'll be talking with Bianca Alexander about fair and sustainable fashion and a fashion revolution day in the 1-year anniversary of the tragedy in Bangladesh. So please stick with us. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C. and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back on the Zero Hour. In this hour, we're going to be talking to futurist Germain Cassio about the problem with prediction, which is the futurist job. So that is a problem, isn't it? Germain is a great guy. He does great work, and I'm looking forward to talking to him about it. We'll be talking with Julia Ho about Students Against Peabody, which should be a fascinating conversation as well. And we will be winding up talking about on this week, which is the anniversary of the tragedy in the Bangladesh factory, the fashion revolution. So we will have a good hour coming up for you. And, I think we can't let this day go by without talking a little bit more about the whole Bundy Ranch story. Now that Cliven Bundy has melted down with his on-air, it's originally quoted, but eventually recorded and placed on air racist rants. The Bundy Ranch controversy, I would guess, is likely to dissipate a little bit. Let's certainly hope so, because it was heading for tragedy. Let's hope that now that even Sean Hannity has been forced to call his remarks abhorrent, and so many of his other political supporters have distanced themselves from him, that at least this particular incident, which had all the inklings of turning violent, will ease up a little bit. That's good news. But the question is, why did this happen? As you know, on this show, on the Zero Hour, we believe there are underlying economic and political forces behind the headlines other than just people are nuts. Now, people may be nuts, but why do certain nuts people get in the headlines while all sorts of other nuts people don't? There are reasons for that. So I guess now that people are backing away from Cliven Bundy, we should be asking what was behind that story. Fox idolized the guy until he became openly racist. Sean Hannity had him on a number of times, asked him flattering questions. He had right-wing extremist Richard Mack on, making comments that really were designed to escalate this potentially violent conflict where people were showing up armed and so on. And as a result, Cliven Bundy called Sean Hannity his hero. Why? Here's why. Because Fox News Network has corporate and political interests that are being served by Hannity's promotion of this right-wing extremist, and by the way, natural resource thief. His anti-federal agenda, that is to say Cliven Bundy's, is closely aligned with that of Charles and David Koch. As we all know, they're major Republican donors, and they're behind the ALEC movement to overtake state government and to make sure that state governments push corporate-friendly agendas. Now, that ALEC puts a lot of money into state races, which the left has sometimes tended to neglect, so that it can pack state houses and let state legislatures with friendly politicians. As part of that, it's also trying to push back against federal ownership of public lands by saying they should be turned back to the states. That happens to be Cliven Bundy's opinion. That happens to be the opinion of the man who's gotten so much airtime on Fox News, despite his extremism and tendency to violence. So you see how it's beginning to all fit together? Now, where do the Koch brothers individually fit in this? The Institute for Public Accuracy studied them, and here's what they said. Georgia Pacific does extensive logging on public lands. Georgia Pacific is owned by the Koch brothers. Private logging of America's national forests is a heavily subsidized form of corporate welfare. This is Institute for Public Accuracy. Logging companies such as Georgia Pacific strip lands bare, destroy vast acreages, and pay only a small fee to the federal government in proportion to what they take from the public. They do not operate in the free market when they log public forests. Okay, that's the end of the Institute for Public Accuracy quote. Now, can you imagine how this for-profit despoiling of a public resource, the public lands, will increase if the Koch brothers get their way and federal lands are turned over to state governments? That's why ALEC and its friendly groups are pushing laws that would demand that. It's bad citizenship, but it's very smart business. Think about it. It's a lot cheaper and easier to buy state governments than it is to take over the federal government. It's much less likely to be noticed, and they've already gone a long way towards doing it. So they're just maximizing the investment they've already made. Now, we could predict this, but the combined lure of potential Koch money and melodrama and television cameras led a lot of Republican politicians to flock to the Bundy Ranch to get their airtime. It led others like Rand Paul to celebrate Cliven Bundy before we saw what he was really about, which is racism, as if that's a surprise. Sean Hannity, I can almost guarantee you, will not reflect on the moral impact of his thoughtless and careless words. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not advocating censoring Sean Hannity or anybody else, But I got to tell you, when the killer in Knoxville shot those Unitarians, and it turned out he had Hannity and Bill O'Reilly's book on his shelf, if somebody had my writings on their shelf and hurt somebody, I go in for some very heavy introspection. Introspection doesn't seem to be Sean Hannity's bag. Instead, he and Fox promoted Bundy's threat to start a range war. They forgot what range wars were in the old movies. If you ever saw the old Westerns, the big cattleman who trampled public property and violated the rights of the farmers and the townspeople, they were the bad guys. These are the bad guys. So what do you do to fight the bad guys when they have all the power and all the attention and politicians in their pocket and money in their pocket? I'll tell you what you do. You do exactly what the farm workers did, as we discussed in the last hour. You organize. I'm RJ Eskow, and we will be right back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we are back on the Zero Hour. And with us is Jaume Cascio, who is a futurist and senior fellow with the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technologies, where I am actually, I think, still characterized as an affiliated scholar. And Jaume was selected by Foreign Policy Magazine as one of the top 100 global thinkers of 2009, and basically writes about the intersection of emerging technologies, environmental dilemmas, and cultural transformation. He's been in this futurist biz for a long time. I think I first encountered his work in worldchanging.com, which was a great website, and they also put out a book, Finding and Calling Attention to Models, Tools, and Ideas for Building a Bright Green Future. And Jaume, thanks so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure, RJ. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you bet. And I haven't seen you in years. I think the last time I saw you was when we both spoke at an IEET event. Must have been about 5-6 years ago, to coincide with Humanity Plus, a big
yes, indeed.
transhumanist event. But thanks for coming on the show. You know, I mean, I don't imagine you've heard it, but we talk a lot about long-term trends in the human future here, as well as the politics of the day. And you've talked at various times and written at various times about the problems with prediction and how to do it right. And I wanted to talk to you for a few minutes about that, if we might. Does that sound okay to you?
Yeah, it sounds great.
You know, I think one of the things you've said in the past is that, and I'm interpreting rather than quoting, but I think one of the things you've basically said in the past is that people don't understand that the art of prediction is the art of presenting alternatives and probabilities and ranges rather than precise snapshots of the future. Is that a reasonably correct, or if simplistic, way to put it?
Oh, definitely. The thing is, prediction is largely impossible. That is, the idea that we can come up with singular, pinpoint, accurate visions of what tomorrow will hold tends not to be true. But we still have to act as if we can figure out the future. The future is uncertain, and yet we must act. It's kind of a code or a common phrase in this field. And so a lot of the work that I do, especially around looking ahead, involves multiple scenario forecasts. So thinking in terms of different possibilities, not as a way of describing precisely exactly what will happen, but instead as a way of illuminating different possible outcomes, hopefully allowing the listener or the reader to become, if not inspired, at the very least aware of possibilities that they weren't aware of before. I sometimes like to think about what we do as being, we're engines of epiphany, allowing people to have that aha moment where they see connections that they didn't see before, see possibilities, see different futures that they couldn't have seen before.
I love that phrase, engines of epiphany, meaning, in effect, that by combining facts and projections, you may provide a glimpse into the possible that feels like an epiphany, not so much that it's a prediction as it is an opening in people's understanding of what is possible in the human future.
Exactly. The analogy that I've come to use in my when I give talks lately is that foresight work is really like a vaccination. So you think about the way that immune systems work. We encounter a pathogen of some kind, our body generates antibodies so that if we encounter that pathogen again, the body's ready. We jumpstart that process with vaccinations, introducing a weakened version of the pathogen so that if we ever encounter that pathogen, our bodies have become sensitive to it. So what foresight does is it makes the body of our organization or our civilization sensitive to outcomes that it might not have recognized before, so that you have a better chance of catching that distant early warning of a change happening that you would have just ignored in the past, because now you see, aha, I see how that evolves into something big.
So, and this is very helpful to me because, at one point, and we're talking with Jermaine Cassio, who works in the Foresight area and is a senior fellow for IEET and is sometimes called a futurist. I don't know if you embrace that word anymore, do you?
It's a word that everyone recognizes, so I kind of glumly go along with it.
All right, okay. And the reason why I ask is because, I've often wondered, I hear people even describe themselves as futurists, and I was one of the people, I think you were too, in this Rough Guide to the Future. They said it was 50 of the world's leading futurists look ahead, and I was one of the 50, and I thought, well, am I a futurist? Or even in the foresight business, but I never really knew for sure, but I think what you're really saying is in a sense, it's the logical extension of how the human brain works, which is if I'm, walking through a mountain pass looking for mountain lions that might jump on me, I'm modeling different potential futures. So if I walk through that pass and I think to myself as a primitive human being, well, one might jump from that rock over there, in which case I better be sure I'm within reach of a big stick to fight it off with. That, in essence, is a primitive form of foresight work, isn't it? Because then if the thing doesn't jump, okay, I didn't say it would jump. I just wanted to model one image of the future in which it might so that I'm prepared for it as a contingency.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And in fact, you're completely right. That is a kind of futurism that we all do. Our brains are wired for that kind of futurism. It actually turns out William Calvin at the University of Washington, a neurophysiologist, had determined that the part of the brain that lights up when we think about the future is actually the same part of the brain that lights up when we throw things at moving targets. So basically it's the ballistics, which is really just trying to predict where something will be. The old Wayne Gretzky line, you don't skate where the puck is, you skate to where the puck will be. That's futurism. That's what our biological systems evolved to do. What we do in this field, whether we call it futurism or foresight work or scenario, strategy, whatever, we're really trying to take that initial biological urge and stretch it out, push it to its greatest boundaries, and try to think about what are these longer-term implications, the surprising outcomes that aren't obvious to us right in front of us, but instead are the logical results of the combinations of forces that are all at play around us.
So let's put this in some sort of real world perspective. They used to think of me as kind of an in-house futurist when I worked for AIG, but they were very hard, kind of street tough businessmen. So they used to say, let's have RJ Eskow. Hey, Richie, model what would happen if our healthcare costs in Hungary went up 10%, and they invented something that a surgery that everybody wanted, and model that. They love the word. And I used to say, well, modeling is my life. Of course I'll do it. But so if I would sit down and scope out, trend lines for this, and this, and then give them 2 or 3 different scenarios, I was doing foresight work, wasn't I?
Yes, you were. Now, what's interesting is that foresight work encompasses such a wide array of methods. So it ranges from that kind of quantitative modeling, simulation type foresight, all the way to what's essentially science fiction, creating these narrative futures where you tell a story, essentially, or actually, realistically, a set of stories about related, parallel, possible futures. And you basically are describing, how do we get from here to there? And it's all in service of making your audience aware of possibilities that they couldn't have conceived of before.
And give us an example of that. How does that work? How does the engine of epiphany produce one in a real life situation? If you're comfortable giving us one.
Well, a lot of the work I do a lot of work with a group called the Institute for the Future, which is a 45-year-old nonprofit foresight strategy group based in Palo Alto. And we have a number of different clients from really around the world, businesses and government agencies. What I have seen time and again working with these different organizations is that when we lay out the different ways in which the future could unfold, whether it's part of our 10-year forecast program or it's in the Technology Horizons or Health Horizons program, what we try to do is explain these possibilities, explain these different scenarios in a way that links to the work that the organizations are doing, so that they start to see the connection between changes in mobile communications and things with mobile phones and the like, and the kinds of speeds that are available, the processing power that's available, and how that, for example, alters people's ability to learn information about themselves and keep track of what's going on in their own bodies. Or as the cameras that we have in our phones get more powerful, how that changes how people relate to each other politically, being able to keep an eye on each other. And so what that does for the client groups, and really what that does for anyone who's an audience, whether they're audience for futurism, whether they're a civilian or a business person or a government official, is really to give them that chance to make the connection between this possibility and what they're doing in their own lives. How does this change my behavior as an official in the Department of State if I know that anything I do can possibly be picked up by just a citizen on a mobile phone? How does it change?
Or how do I change going forward? An epiphany moment might be, how do I change my behavior if I'm a beat officer who likes to shake down minority people, but 2 years from now, camera contact lenses may be so cheap that I'll never know when they're filming me. I bet that might be an epiphany moment too, right?
Exactly. And then so you take that exact same example and then say, it's not you're the beat officer, but you are a lawyer for a movie production house, knowing that anyone could walk into a theater with high-quality cameras on contact lenses and copy the movie that they're watching without anyone ever knowing that copy is being made. That's that kind of aha, oh crap moment.
Right. Oh, aha is either accompanied by wow or oh crap, in my experience.
Exactly.
So listen, it's a fascinating area. I hope you will come back and talk to us a little bit more about some specific case studies in the future.
I would love to.
All right. Jemay Cassio, Senior Fellow with the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technologies. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Richard Eskow, and RJ Eskow, and we will be right back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we are back back on whatever this show is called, the Zero Hour. That's what it's called, and we're glad to have you back. You know what? We talked with Ernie Powell in the last hour, activist and organizer, about the power of determined people sitting in and making a difference and striking and organizing, and that used to happen much more in our society. It used to happen in the university world too. It's still happening. At Washington University in St. Louis, students were sitting in to protest the university's relationship with Peabody Energy and Peabody Coal. We have one of the organizers of that demonstration with us today, a junior at Washington University, Julia Ho. Julia, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you bet. Thanks for your good work too. Now, you guys were sitting in. Tell us a little bit about that and the current state of your action. First, tell us about the action, and then we'll talk about why.
Yeah. So we're Students Against Peabody. Basically, our mission is to pressure the university to cut ties with Peabody Energy, which is the largest private sector coal corporation in the world, and whose CEO sits on our board of trustees and also gives, millions of dollars to fund clean coal research here. So, we don't think that's right. We think that corporate interest on our board shouldn't dictate what our research goes towards, and also that, in both the social and environmental justices that Peabody has caused through their business practices are not something that align with our university's mission. So that's basically what we're about. Over the past 18, 17 days, we were sitting in Brookings Hall, which is the administration's office, and basically demanding a few different things. One, that the university take a public stance on having CEO Greg Boyce on their board, that they go on community tours of extraction sites to see sort of the extent of the damage that Peabody is causing to a lot of these communities, and also to create a mechanism whereby students can have more voice on the board. So over the last 17 days, these demands have changed a lot. They've gone through negotiations a lot. But essentially what happened is on Monday, the university came out with a public statement and said, had a very, very watered down version of our demands and, refused to go on community tours, refused to take a public stance. Their public statement did not even say Peabody in it once, but instead offered to do things like host symposiums on corporate social responsibility and such. So, since then, we definitely haven't given up, but we have recognized that the university has only, or our chancellor, even though he does have the power to make these decisions, really does have he has his hands tied by these corporations. And at the end of the day, he really it's clear that he's more accountable to them than he is to us. So I think
let's talk about that for a second,
yeah.
if I can jump in there, Julia.
Oh, sure.
We're talking to Julia Ho, one of the organizers of a student demonstration against the cozy corporate relationships at Washington University, especially with Peabody Coal. And okay, so you said at one point you had negotiations, and was it during the course of these negotiations that you concluded that your chancellor didn't have the ability to meet your demands, or did you decide that whether or not he has the ability, he's not willing to defy the corporate interests on his board or the corporate funders of the university, or how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, so basically, like I said, we were sitting in for 17 days straight. We got a meeting with the chancellor within 4 days of sitting in, but it was clear at that first meeting that they weren't really ready to listen to us. And then over the course of the next week and a half, we really went through a series of meetings with them where we were working on our demands, and we were actually at a point where it seemed like they were really concerned about extraction sites. They were showing concern for a lot of the things that we were, but they weren't giving us anything in writing. So whenever we came back and on Sunday night, and we basically said, this is what we're willing to do, this is what we want to break camp, are you willing to give it to us? And basically they came back and said no. So from that, although sitting in was an extremely effective strategy for us in bringing people together who care about this issue, in raising the profile around this issue, and also questioning not just the corporate, not just Peabody, but also a lot of the other corporate interests on our board, like Monsanto, like Arch Coal, like Boeing, and Bank of America, all of these things. We think it was a very effective strategy for that, but in the end, sitting in was only going to do so much to push our administration, and so at this point, we're at a point in our campaign where we're moving forward and basically going straight to the Board of Trustees and going straight to Greg Boyce, who's going to be here next week on May 1st for a Board of Trustees meeting.
And now, who's Greg Boyce?
So Greg Boyce is the CEO of Peabody Energy, and he has been on our board since 2009.
So we're talking with Julia Ho, one of the organizers of student protests against corporate influence at Washington University in St. Louis. As I know you know, Julia, I'm pretty sure you know, your university is not unique in its increasing dependence on corporate funders, which brings along with it an increasing eagerness to please the corporations, maybe change the curriculum and or the research projects to attract and retain corporate money. And we see in Syracuse University is very much in bed with JP Morgan Chase, the criminally inclined serial corporate offender bank, and have had Jamie Dimon, the CEO, as their speaker, and a business school that's basically a feeder system for JP Morgan Chase, on and on and on. So this is a national problem of universities getting in bed with corporations. Have you guys given any thought, in addition to the things you were planning to do, of maybe reaching out to students on other campuses?
Oh, absolutely. We've already gotten a lot of support from students all across Missouri who are very inspired by what we're doing, and we're hoping that this action is really part of a larger divestment movement and part of a sort of an escalation in the divestment movement, and thinking not a little bit past purely divestment, but also thinking towards social responsibility. And so, a lot of people ask, like, why Peabody? Why not go after Monsanto? Why not go after all these other corporate interests on your board? And really the reason is because Peabody has a long history of draining, of having influence not just over Washington University, but also over the city of St. Louis. And so Peabody is a major funder of many, many social institutions here, like our zoo, our opera house, our science center, all of these things that they give funding for. And we're really questioning that and wondering, should we be relying on these corporations, and particularly Peabody, which has a long history of violating workers' rights, of displacing people from their homes, of displacing tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homes, of destroying public health, of environmental degradation, all of these things. We don't think that that our university's well-being should be dependent on these corporations, and we don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, see, I think your choice of Peabody was very, very smart, because it's very important, as you know, when you're trying to mobilize people, which is what any action like yours is designed to do, and change their way of thinking, to pick a target that is close to people's lives. So you're there in Missouri, you're there in St. Louis, the Peabody name is everywhere, the Peabody corporate presence is there, the Peabody impact on the environment is nearby. So I think you chose very wisely, and I guess the question now going forward is, and by the way, I do want to say, you mentioned the phrase social responsibility. I don't have to tell you, but be wary when they say, oh, we'll get involved with corporate social responsibility. That's usually tax deductible publicity raising feel-good programs that the corporation runs. So that. So you'll go into that cautiously. But going forward, what are you guys going to be doing? We got about, I guess, a minute and a half left. What's your group planning for? I know you're reaching out to these other places, and you got anything else in mind? You've moved out of the administration building.
Yeah, so May 1st, which is next Thursday, there's actually going to be, like I said, a board of trustees meeting on our campus where Greg Boyce is going to physically be here. And so we are basically challenging him and saying, challenging a university, but also directly challenging Greg Boyce, saying, what are you doing? What are you doing to our city? What are you doing to our schools here? They've diverted millions of dollars from public schools here in the city. And so, that's sort of the next step in our campaign. And we know that we're going against a corporate giant. It's the largest private sector corporation in the world, and we don't have we don't expect to end Peabody now, but we do want to, at least, like I said, really start this conversation about corporate interests on our board and corporate interests in our cities. And, what good are they actually doing us in the end? And so I think that this is part of, like I said, a much larger narrative, hopefully something that will happen nationwide, and not just among students, but among, all members of the community.
Well, good luck to you on that. And since May 1st is May Day, it's also our official launch date for this program. We're doing some events around that. I'll tell you what, why don't you or someone else from your group come on the show on May 2nd and tell us how it went?
Yeah, we'd love to do that.
It's a deal. All right. We've been speaking with Julia Ho about their great student action at Washington University in St. Louis. The kids are all right, as the song goes. Thanks so much. And we'll talk to you next week.
Okay, great. Sounds awesome.
I'm RJ Eskow, and we will be right back on the Zero Hour. We are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and in this segment, we want to, first of all, honor the victims of the Bangladesh factory disaster, which took place 1 year ago yesterday, and our next guest will talk to us about it, what she did about it, and hopefully what we can do about it going forward. Bianca Alexander is host and director of Conscious Living TV, and it was Socrates who said the unexamined life is not worth living, so we support Conscious Living here, and she organized to both memorialize the victims and to provide pressure on some of the outlets here in the country that take advantage of low third world wages. Bianca, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You bet. Now, listen, let's start. I could read your whole biography, but it's great, and I want to really talk about what you're doing and what we might be able to do going forward. Yesterday, you had something you called Fashion Revolution Day, and maybe you can tell us, or April 24th, I guess it was. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yes, well, Fashion Revolution Day is a global movement, a campaign that is now active in 58 countries around the globe in response to the Rana Plaza garment factory collapse that happened a year ago on April 24th, 2013, where 1,133 sweatshop workers were killed in a building collapse and 2,500 were injured. Unfortunately, this is something that was completely avoidable, but for the fact that the garment workers have very little say in their day, in their wages, in their working conditions, there was a crack discovered in the building the day before, and instead of condemning the building and shutting it down, the first two floors, which included a bank and a couple other commercial businesses, evacuated, and the next day, the managers of the garment workers who worked on the top floors insisted that the workers come back to work and threatened them that they would lose an entire month full of wages, which is a mere $100-some per month. And so many of them did come back to work. Some did not, but those who did, met their fate when the building collapsed. And so Fashion Revolution Day is a call to action to say enough is enough. The race to the bottom of the supply chain and creating fast fashion, which we as consumers, when we shop at stores like Forever 21 and The Gap and Walmart, create an environment in a world where, the price of a T-shirt, unfortunately, is less than the value of a human life.
Well, exactly. And as we've learned with struggles in the past, whether it's the farm workers who we were talking about earlier or others, that getting sometimes the only way to awaken the corporate conscience is at the point of sale. And I think part of what you were doing and part of what this movement was doing, the Fashion Revolution Day, is to talk about who made your clothes, where do these come from, and I suppose from that, avoiding clothes that were made through the exploitation of the lives and bodies and health of workers in third world countries, right?
Exactly. Part of the problem is that we as consumers are not being responsible in how we shop with our votes. And so every time that similar to the slow food movement, the slow fashion movement is really about looking at the opportunity to make a choice and make a statement with every single purchase that you make. There's power in consumption if we use it in the right way.
So how did it go yesterday? You guys had the, this whole movement had the Fashion Revolution Day. A lot of people signed on to it, including the Fashion Revolution Day ambassador, Amber Valletta, supermodel and actress, and a bunch of other people. How did it go? Would you call it a success, or do we need to try again and get more headwind behind this?
Yeah, well, it was a very successful day. The beautiful thing about this campaign, and forgive me, I'm actually traveling now, so if there's a little noise in the background, excuse that. It was a great success. I mean, the entire campaign was a purely volunteer campaign with, very little, if no budget at all, and we relied on just the hard work and the passion and the dedication and commitment of a volunteer board of pioneering thought leaders and ethical designers and people that are already working on the ground to make this movement hopefully catch fire, not just this year, but in years to come. But as a result of our efforts, which were primarily directed towards social media, again, it's free marketing, we were the number one trending Twitter handle yesterday on social media. We were number one, the Fashion Revolution campaign. Now, again, it's a campaign in 50-some countries around the globe, but that's a huge accomplishment for a nonprofit, volunteer, zero-funded campaign, to bring more consciousness to an industry which is incredibly dark. So we're very pleased with that, and we were able to get endorsements from celebrities like Amber Valletta and Lydia First, Cohen's first wife, and many other pioneers who are, again, working on the ground level and who are willing to lend their name to something that hopefully year after year, this is our first year, Fashion Revolution Day, hopefully will be something that continues, year after year will continue to not just bring awareness, but actually move the needle forward, from a business perspective where manufacturers begin to take more responsibility about how they're manufacturing and hopefully to invest in the communities that they're relying so heavily on. I mean, the average worker, 8 a.m. to midnight every single day, 7 days a week, no days off. So it's a huge, huge amount of commitment for a single human life to make just so that we can wear clothes.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking with Bianca Alexander, who's the host of Conscious TV, and we're talking about the Fashion Revolution Day movement. And I've got to tell you, Bianca, I spend a lot of time in New York and Washington, and my home base is right near the epicenter of one of the epicenters of the fashion world. I think a lot more people would sign on to this as it goes forward. A lot more celebrities, a lot more influential people in these worlds. And so, what's happening next? It sounds like it was a great success, but obviously the struggle's not over. It's just beginning. So what happens next, and where can people go to find out more?
Yeah, well, you can find out information about Fashion Revolution at fashionrevolution.org, or the U.S. campaign, for which I serve as the Director of Communications, at fashionrevolutionusa.org. And one of the things we've done is we've partnered with great brands that we feel are doing the work that is important that many of the larger, more mainstream manufacturers are not doing, and that's creating transparent supply chains. And so as we move forward, we want to really not only put pressure on brands to sign the Bangladesh Accord, which is a legally binding agreement that requires an investment for all manufacturers in Bangladesh to invest in the safety and inspection infrastructure. And, this is not about going and making 100% organic cotton T-shirts. It's about investing in inspections so that things like the Tazreen fire, and there's many other catastrophes that have happened beyond Rana Plaza. This is just one example that I think is kind of like the straw that hit the camel's back, so that those who are manufacturing in Bangladesh and in other countries around the world, trying to get the bottom dollar on the garments that we Americans mostly with fast fashion are consuming, are actually being responsible for the environments that they're creating and the work environments that, unfortunately, without labor rights and no legally formed unions, it's actually something that people have been attacked and assaulted. Anytime they try to form unions, they really don't have much of a say in saying, hey, no, I want a day off.
No, they don't, but we do, which is why I really like the idea of what you're doing. And it's concrete, which is effective, and it's fashionable, which draws a lot of interest. So people who want to know more can go to fashionrevolution.org, or for the U.S., fashionrevolutionusa.org. And the next time I run into a celebrity in a 12-step meeting, I'll send them to you. How's that?
Yes, and be sure everyone should ask the question, who made your clothes? Turn around, look at your label, and find out if that person is being treated fairly and being paid for the work that they're doing. Everyone deserves that. It's a basic human right.
Absolutely. So we're going to keep track of what you're doing. Bianca Alexander, thanks so much for being with us to talk about the Fashion Revolution. And that's our program for today. We talked with economist Dean Baker at length about Thomas Piketty's book on inequality and wealth and capital. We talked with Ernie Powell, veteran organizer, about organizing among the generations and the inspiring history of the farm workers movement. We talked with Richard Rothstein about his study of segregation 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education. We talked with Jamé Cassio about the forecasting industry and the problem with prediction. We talked with student activist Julia Ho, who's doing a great job with her colleagues out at Washington University. We're going to check back with her next week. We talked with Bianca Alexander about the Fashion Revolution. It's on, people. Things are changing. Things are moving. I can feel it. Stick with us. Come back next week and we'll have more of the same. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.